I'm Randy Cassingham, founder, publisher, and chief futurist at thisistrue.com, the longest running entertainment newsletter on the internet. Let's get right into it. I'm only going to do one question because I think this is going to take most of 10 minutes. Gary in Florida asks, I've never worked for NASA but have friends who did, and every one of them has an interesting story about how they ended up there. Do you have such a story? It's an interesting question because I've never considered that before, even though I do have an interesting story. But I've never thought of asking other colleagues that, or I don't even, right off the top of my head, recall other employees with interesting stories that they've offered. But yes, I do have an interesting story. So if you didn't know already, I worked at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory for 10 years, from 1986 to 1996, and then I quit to work full-time on This Is True. I overlapped the two for 2 years because my business plan that I came up with predicted that I would be able to support myself after 2 years, at least for a while. And it was touch and go after 2 years. I did quit almost to the day 2 years later, and it worked out. But it was touch and go. When I moved to Colorado to be away from JPL, didn't want to be tempted to go back, although they did bring me back briefly for a consulting gig, and I don't even remember what the subject of that was. Interestingly enough, I do remember going back and getting my badge back and being there for a little while. But we're talking 30 years ago now, so I don't remember. But anyway, so how did I get hired at JPL is an interesting question, an interesting story. So I had moved back to Southern California with my girlfriend, who was shortly to become my first wife, and she needed to go to Southern California. She was from the Inland Empire, as they called it, east of Los Angeles, and she had gotten a fellowship at Claremont Graduate School. So that meant she was getting some money to help pay for her master's degree in finance. She was a wizard at finance, and did very well with that. And when we arrived in Southern Cal and was getting ready to start the school year, the graduate school had a reception for all of the new fellowship students, and they were asked to bring their spouses, and so I went along, and there was another guy there whose spouse was also a recipient of fellowship, and we kind of gravitated toward each other because we were both felt a little out of place there. And he asked me what I did for a living, and I said, well, I'm currently trying to get some tech writing work. That's my specialty when I was writing was writing before This Is True was to explain technical topics to a lay audience. So I thought that would be a pretty good market for finding some tech writing work. And I did get an interview. We went down a little bit early because the place where I did an interview wanted me to come in for a second interview. So it was a pretty good shot. They had 2 positions open. And so I went in to do my second interview, which went pretty well. And then didn't hear anything back from them. Yes, I'm on a tangent. So I didn't hear anything back, and I finally called the guy and said, haven't heard back from you. You said you'd call back the next day, and you didn't. And he said, oh, sorry, we had 2 openings, and you came in 3rd, and I gave it to the other guys because they had kids, and you don't. And it's like, oh, that's illegal, but okay. So here I am, very disappointed at this reception, and the guy, Dave, heard that I was looking for work, and he said, that's interesting because the gal in the next office for me is looking for someone for a publishing project. You want me to give her your number? And I said, sure. Where do you work? NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and it has to do with the space station. It's like, oh, okay, well, that's awfully interesting. So I gave him my name and number, and this was on a Saturday, and so Monday morning, sure enough, the phone rings, and it's the gal in the next office, Laura, who talks with me a little bit and decides, yes, I want you to come in for an interview. Can you come in tomorrow? So I said, sure. And so I got instructions on how to get into the lab, because it's just a fairly secure facility, a little bit looser then than it is post 9/11, but you still had to go through visitor control. So I parked my car and went into visitor control to say I had an appointment there. And so after giving my name and who I was meeting with, I sat down to wait, and as I was sitting there, I heard a voice that was very familiar to me, and I was listening and trying to figure out where that was coming from, and the voice was Paul Winchell. And probably these days not a lot of people know who Paul Winchell is or was, but he was a ventriloquist, actually. That's why I couldn't find out where his voice was coming from. So Paul Winchell had a TV show called The Winchell Mahoney Show, and I watched that as a kid. His main dummy was Jerry Mahoney, and Jerry Mahoney's dummy sidekick, his best friend was called Knucklehead. And I think, as I recall, it was little skits and in between cartoons, and I watched that, and Paul Winchell did the voices for the dummies, and I'm quite sure he appeared live on camera, so I knew what he looked like, certainly knew what his regular voice sounded like, and I was just absolutely aware that this man, who I knew had also invented one of the first artificial hearts, was in the room with me. And I decided I should not go over and be a geeky fanboy and say hello, and because obviously he was busy talking to somebody or at a table, probably a JPLer, and I did not want to interrupt that. So Laura finally comes over and picks me up and takes me over to her office for an in-person interview, and she liked what she heard, and so the next step was to take me to her boss. That was Ken, and Ken was an interesting guy that I got to know pretty well, was pretty good friends with for my tenure there. And one of the things I had told Laura was that, here is a piece of writing I've done recently. It's science writing. It's about tsunamis, formerly called tidal waves, and they have nothing to do with the tides. So tsunami is a much better term. And it had arrived in the mail Monday morning. So when I went in to interview, of course, I brought the magazine with me, and basically it's to show that I could do pretty complex writing of complex subjects, at least, and explain them in a way that was useful. The job they wanted me for was to write and publish a user's guide, an introductory user's guide to the space station, which was still in the planning stages in 1986. And they wanted a handbook to basically describe what the facilities were on the space station, so that if an experimenter wants to send a package up to the space station, what kind of power levels could they get? How good is the microgravity? Is it, because there's no such thing as zero gravity really, because there's always something disturbing the gravity a little bit, is from the astronauts moving around, if nothing else, but also machinery moving around. So could they get cooling if they needed it? Was there a freezer there for biological samples? All that kind of stuff. They wanted it. NASA headquarters assigned JPL the job of creating this document. So I go in to see Ken for the follow-up interview to get the okie dokie to be hired, and he was looking over my resume and such and asking me a few questions, and he was looking down at my resume and other things that he was reviewing, and I said, and here's an example of some of my writing, and I had the magazine, and he looked up briefly and said, "Oh yeah, I read that last night. It was very good." And I went back to looking at his stuff, and I basically thought, yeah, I think I've got this job, and finished up. And Laura said she would call me the next day, and I think she called me that evening and said, could I be there the next day? And I said, absolutely. Let's see, she called me Monday, I interviewed Tuesday, and I started Wednesday. Yep, so it was the next day. And got the job and loved it. The document actually was never published. It was redone a number of times. As soon as I finished with it, I even made some trips back to headquarters to go through the NASA photo library and pick out illustrations for it. And, it was a big project, and I'd finish it and I'd send the draft to headquarters to the sponsor, and he would look at it and said, "This is really good, but we're about to do a rescope of the station, a little redesign. So when that comes out, update it with all that new information and send me a new draft." And what was happening was the space station was projected to be very large and very complex for $8 billion. And as they were doing the design work, they were realizing there's no way they can do this for $8 billion. So they would redesign to make it smaller and more expensive. Not smaller and less expensive, but they're already realizing there's no way we're going to do it for 8. So what can we do for 10 and redesign for that? And then they say, well, what can we do to make it smaller and redo it for 15? And it just went on and on until my boss finally said, would you take all of this stuff, the document, all the pictures, everything, and fly back to the sponsor in Washington, D.C. at NASA headquarters and say, we would like to give this back to you. And by the way, can we keep the leftover money in the account? Because they had already prepaid 6 figures for several years of work. And I said, really? That wasn't Ken that asked me that. It was the space station boss at JPL Pasadena. And he said, yep, that's what I want you to do. And I said, all right. So I did. And to my surprise, the sponsor said, yeah, I think that's a good idea. And they didn't want us to send the money back because that just involved a heck of a lot of paperwork, and there were other things we could do anyway. So my space station boss reprogrammed that to cover some other studies and stuff, and went on to other things. And I think that's a pretty interesting story of my getting going at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So if you like the video, please click like, please click subscribe if you haven't done that already. You know, it does help other people find the videos and help spread the word a little bit. I appreciate it. I'm Randy Cassingham, and I'll talk at you later.